Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Volkswagen, Audi, Porsche. For a century, these weren't just car brands. They were synonyms for perfection. They were the dream. They were the aspiration. They were what success looked like when you combined engineering with obsession, craftsmanship with industrial scale. But in 2026, something unthinkable happened. The German automotive empire started to crumble, not metaphorically, literally. And what we're watching isn't a temporary crisis or a market fluctuation that will pass with the economic cycle. It's the beginning of the end for the companies that once ruled the entire world, unchallenged and unquestionable. Think about what a German car used to mean. When your father bought a Mercedes, it wasn't just a purchase, it was a statement, it was a promise that this machine would outlast him, that the engineering was so precise, so uncompromising, that it would never betray him. And when someone drove a BMW, they weren't just sitting in a car. They were sitting in the culmination of generations of mechanical perfection. Volkswagen democratized that dream. They built cars for regular people that had the same obsessive attention to detail as the luxury brands. They were reliable. They were efficient. They were built to last. And for nearly 80 years, the world believed in that promise. The numbers are staggering, almost incomprehensible in their scale. In the first quarter of this year, while Japanese automakers and American companies were growing their profits, German car makers did something they had never done before. They moved in the opposite direction. While the global automotive industry saw revenue increase by 2%, powered by Toyota, Honda, Ford, and General Motors, posting solid gains, the big three of Germany, Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz, posted a 4% decline. That 6-point gap doesn't sound dramatic when you say it quickly, but it represents a fundamental rupture in the world order. Germany was the only major car-producing bloc moving backward. Everyone else was moving ahead. By the third quarter of 2025, things had deteriorated so badly that the numbers almost seemed like fiction. The combined operating profit of Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz collapsed. Not declined, collapsed. They fell by 76% in a single quarter. They made just over 1.7 billion euros. That's the lowest figure in 16 years. 16 years. For companies that have been around for more than a century, that's a death knell ringing in the distance. An executive from the consulting firm EY, a man named Konstantin Gall, looked at these numbers and called it what it was. A perfect storm. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't use soft language about market corrections or cyclical downturns. He said German manufacturers were caught in something they couldn't escape from. The premium segment was weakening globally. American tariff policy was making it harder to sell in the world's largest market. Currency exchange rates were working against them. Their massive investments in electric vehicles hadn't paid off yet. And then there were the restructuring costs. Billions upon billions spent trying to transform factories, retrain workers, and pivot toward technology they didn't invent and don't fully understand yet. 3 years ago, German automakers sold hundreds of billions of euros worth of cars and components to China. It was a relationship built on the fundamental belief that Germans made better cars, and Chinese consumers would always pay for quality. That assumption was wrong. In 2025, German automotive exports to China collapsed. They didn't decline gradually or fall modestly. They plunged by roughly a third. The value of automotive and parts exports fell below 14 billion euros. Just 2 years earlier, that figure had been close to 30 billion euros. 30 billion to 14 billion. That's not a market correction. That's a market abandonment. What happened in China was simple and devastating. Chinese companies started making electric vehicles. They got good at it. They got really good at it. BYD, NIO, XPeng, Li Auto, companies that Germans didn't consider serious competitors 5 years ago, are now not just competing, but absolutely dominating the world's most important automobile market. And it's not like Chinese consumers are accepting inferior products out of nationalism or patriotic loyalty. They're choosing Chinese EVs because those cars are genuinely better for what they want and need. They're cheaper, yes, but that's only part of it. They're technologically advanced in ways that matter. They have better software integration. They have superior autonomous driving features. They offer longer range with smaller batteries. And crucially, they're made by companies that understand the Chinese market intimately, speak the Chinese language, understand Chinese culture, and don't have a century of combustion engine expertise biasing every decision they make. A century of mastering gasoline engines, paradoxically, became a weakness when the world shifted to electricity. The German automakers are watching as their most profitable market evaporates, and they're powerless to stop it. Because what's happening in China isn't temporary. It's structural. It's permanent. China now produces more than 30% of the world's automobiles. More than 1 in 3 cars built on this planet is built in China. And Germany's share of that production? Declining every single month. But here's what makes this crisis fundamentally different from previous downturns in the auto industry. It's not just about losing markets or missing a product cycle. It's It's not about a temporary demand collapse that will recover in a few years. It's about what happens to the people. It's about the workers who have built their lives around these factories. It's about the communities that have depended on these jobs for generations. And this is where the crisis stops being an abstract economic story and becomes something deeply, tragically human. Volkswagen is the largest automaker in the world by some measures. It's also the largest private employer in Germany. When Volkswagen gets sick, Germany gets sick. And Volkswagen is very sick. The company is planning to cut up to 100,000 jobs. 100,000, not over 20 years, not over 10 years, but over the next few years, with major cuts happening before the end of this decade. These aren't abstract statistics. These are people, families, workers who have spent their entire careers building Volkswagens, who expected to work there until retirement, who planned their futures on the assumption that there would always be a Volkswagen factory to work at. The closures are specific and brutal. Volkswagen is planning to shut down 4 German plants that currently employ roughly 40,000 workers. 40,000 people will walk out of their factories for the last time. They're also eliminating up to half of their entire model lineup. Think about that. Half of everything they make will disappear. They're cutting annual global production capacity from 10 million vehicles to 9 million. They're consolidating development. They're shutting down regional operations. This isn't restructuring. This is triage. And Volkswagen is just one company. BMW announced it would cut several thousand jobs in Germany by the end of 2027 under a voluntary redundancy program. Several thousand. The company's new CEO, Milan Nedeljkovic, told workers that the rules dictating the industry had substantially changed. The foundation of BMW's business model was broken. He didn't say they would recover. He said the game was different now. Mercedes-Benz, the luxury brand that once seemed immune to market forces, took a different approach. They postponed bonus payments for almost 3/4 of their employees until 2027. But that wasn't enough. They proposed extending the working week from 35 to 40 hours without additional pay. They also wrote off more than 700 million euros due to competition in China. 700 million euros, and a single accounting adjustment, vanished. And they hinted at moving certain jobs abroad entirely. Audi announced 7,500 job cuts by 2029. Porsche, which seemed untouchable just a few years ago, announced it would cut 1,900 jobs, with an additional 2,000 fixed-term contracts simply expiring. The company said it wouldn't do forced layoffs, that restructuring would happen through voluntary departures. But that's cold comfort when you're watching an empire dissolve around you. The German Association of the Automotive Industry, the VDA, looked at all of this and revised its forecasts. Previously, they anticipated 125,000 job losses across the industry over the next decade, but they updated that number. It's worse now. Much worse. And that's just the official forecast. Volkswagen alone has agreed with its Works Council to cut 50,000 jobs. Multiply that across the entire industry, across all the suppliers and manufacturers and component makers, and you're looking at something that resembles an industrial apocalypse. 100,000 workers will lose their jobs at Volkswagen, thousands more at BMW, Mercedes, Audi, and Porsche. Tens of thousands more at the supplier companies, the companies that make engines, transmissions, electrical systems, everything that goes into a car. ZF announced it would cut 450 jobs at Koblenz by 2030. Continental is cutting 3,000 jobs in research and development by the end of 2026. BorgWarner is cutting nearly half its workforce at some facilities, and these aren't decisions made in isolation. These are symptoms of a broader collapse. The thing that makes this so striking is that Germany isn't just losing jobs in some abstract economic sense. Germany is losing its identity. The German auto industry doesn't just make cars, it defines what Germany is. German engineering, German precision, German quality, these aren't marketing slogans. They're the foundation of how Germany sees itself and how the world sees Germany. When you take away the auto industry, you take away a huge part of what makes Germany Germany. Whole regions of the country were built around those factories. Cities were built, communities were built, pensions were built. Entire families, generations, had the assumption that there would always be work at the local Volkswagen plant or BMW factory or Mercedes facility. That assumption is gone now, shattered. Nobody really knows what comes next. But let's understand why this is actually happening. Because it's not one thing, it's not just one problem that could be fixed. It's a convergence of catastrophes, each one compounding the others, creating what Konstantin Gall called a perfect storm. And once you see all these forces acting at the same time, you understand why German automakers can't just innovate their way out of this. They can't just cut costs and bounce back. The problem is bigger than that. First, there's overcapacity. German automakers built factories for a world that no longer exists. They built production lines assuming they would make gasoline and diesel cars forever. They planned for demand that would keep growing every year. But demand didn't keep growing. It contracted, especially for traditional cars. So now they have massive factories. with massive fixed costs, producing cars that the market doesn't want at the rate they thought it would. That's expensive, very expensive, and there's no easy fix except to shut the factories down, which means layoffs. Third, there's the electric vehicle transition. For a century, German automakers were the undisputed masters of the combustion engine. They understood everything about gasoline and diesel. They had perfected it. They had economies of scale. They had supplier networks optimized for traditional powertrains. But then the world decided combustion engines were ending, not because of market forces, because of government mandates. Europe decided that internal combustion engines would be phased out. Battery electric vehicles would be the future. And suddenly, the thing that German companies were best at, building perfect gasoline engines, became irrelevant. The transition to EVs should have been an advantage for German companies. They had the resources. They had the engineering talent. They had the brand power. But instead, they've struggled. They're late to market in many segments. Chinese companies, which didn't have a century of combustion engine expertise, could start fresh. They could optimize for EVs from the beginning. They could build software, which is now more important than ever. And they did. They built better, cheaper, more advanced electric vehicles. German companies are now playing catch-up in their own future. And here's the really depressing part. Volkswagen is still the largest car company in Germany. BMW is third. Mercedes is fourth. Skoda, a Volkswagen subsidiary that was long considered the poor relation, is now the second most popular brand in Germany. Even Volkswagen's own subsidiary is outperforming it. This isn't healthy competition. This is a collapse of brand value and competitive positioning. The fourth factor is software. For a century, cars were primarily mechanical devices, governed by the laws of physics and thermodynamics. An engineer could understand a car completely by understanding mechanics, metallurgy, combustion processes, and materials science. But modern cars, especially electric cars, are fundamentally software platforms on wheels. They're essentially computers with batteries and motors attached. Tesla understood this from the beginning and built the company around software-first thinking. Chinese companies, unencumbered by automotive tradition, adapted to this mindset immediately and built their companies from the ground up as software companies that happened to make cars. But German companies? They were built on mechanical excellence. They built software divisions from scratch, several years late, trying desperately to catch up, trying to develop autonomous driving capabilities, trying to reverse engineer the software competence that companies like Tesla had built over a decade. It's like asking a master blacksmith who spent 50 years perfecting the forge to suddenly become a software engineer. The skills don't transfer. The culture doesn't transfer. The training doesn't transfer. The mentality doesn't transfer. And German automakers have been losing billions upon billions trying to build software competence that they fundamentally don't have in their DNA. Volkswagen created Cariad, an entire software division meant to be the company's technological savior, positioning it as the future of the company. And then, after realizing it wasn't working, they announced it would cut 1,600 jobs from that division by the end of 2025. They were betting everything on software and then immediately cutting it because they realized they were failing at it. It's a contradiction that perfectly encapsulates how lost they truly are, how paralyzed by uncertainty, how unable to pivot decisively in either direction. Fifth, there's the cost structure. German labor is expensive. German factories are expensive to operate. German regulations are stringent. German workers have strong protections. All of this was fine when German cars were premium products, selling at premium prices. But in a world where Chinese EVs are becoming as good or better, cost matters more. And German costs are killing them. They can't compete with Chinese companies on price. They can't compete with American companies on innovation. They're trapped in the middle, too expensive to be affordable, not different enough to command premium prices. Finally, there's the China factor. China isn't just a market that's disappearing. China is a competitor that's rising. Chinese automakers are becoming global players. They're exporting to Europe. They're exporting to Southeast Asia. They're exporting to Africa. They're building battery factories. They're building supply chains. They're doing what German companies have always done. They're building better cars and selling them globally. But this time, the Germans aren't the ones building the better cars. And that fact alone is revolutionary. So when you add all of this together, overcapacity, tariffs, EV transition struggles, software inadequacy, cost disadvantages, and Chinese competition, you get a company like Volkswagen, which was the largest automaker in the world just 5 years ago, now announcing layoffs measured in the hundreds of thousands. You get luxury brands like BMW and Mercedes losing relevance. You get entire regions of Germany facing economic devastation. The data from 2026 shows a German automotive market that's barely recovering. Registrations are up slightly, by around 5.8% in the first half of the year compared to last year, but it's still roughly 20% below 2019 levels. It's still weak. It's still struggling. And the forecasts for the full year suggest only a 2% growth in total registrations to around 2.9 million vehicles. That's essentially stagnation. In an industry this size, stagnation is death. You're watching this right now. 8,500 aftershocks rattling through the Philippines, and the ground just shifted again. Not yesterday, not hours ago, right now. And the news isn't telling you what this really means, what's actually at risk, or why this pattern is accelerating. Let's start where the headlines stop. The Philippines sits on the most seismically active region on Earth. You already know that. What you don't know is that the current swarm isn't a random cluster, it's a signature. It's the Earth's crust telling you something is critically out of balance beneath one of the most densely populated archipelagos in the world. Over 8,500 recorded tremors in a single sequence. That's not routine. That's not normal aftershock behavior. That's not what your government sources are emphasizing when they issue their prepared statements. Here's what happened, and here's what the careful bureaucratic language is obscuring. The initial event struck with the kind of violence that redefined the seismic baseline for the entire region. We're talking about a magnitude that snapped infrastructure, killed people instantly, and sent shockwaves not just through the ground, but through every emergency response system the Philippines has built. But the aftershocks, that's where the real story lives, where the science becomes urgent, and where the risk calculus changes completely. When you get into the 8,000 range for aftershocks, you're no longer looking at what seismologists call a standard Omori decay. That's the term for the way aftershocks are supposed to taper off exponentially after a major earthquake. Fewer tremors, smaller magnitudes, predictable rhythm. The Philippines isn't following that script. The aftershocks are sustaining. Some are strong enough to damage buildings that were already compromised. Some are triggering cascading failures in infrastructure that survive the initial shock. And each one is a reminder that the fault system hasn't stabilized. It's still adjusting, still finding equilibrium, still capable of surprise. The most dangerous aftershocks aren't the ones that exceed magnitude 5 or 6. Those get attention. Those make news broadcasts. The dangerous ones are the mid-range shocks, magnitude 4.5 to 5.5, because they hit structures that are already weakened, already stressed, already on the edge of collapse. A building that survived the main event with minor to moderate damage becomes a death trap when it's hit by a sequence of sustained mid-range tremors over days and weeks. The cumulative stress exceeds design tolerances. Cracks propagate through load-bearing walls. Partial collapses become total collapses. In the Philippines, with millions of people living in older structures, with enforcement of building codes that's inconsistent at best and absent at worst in rural areas, is facing exactly that scenario. Let's talk about what the seismic networks are actually showing and why the mainstream coverage is missing the significance. The Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, PHIVOLCS, has deployed its network across the archipelago. They're recording everything: magnitude, location, depth, mechanism. The data is clean. What's alarming in that data isn't being frontlined because it requires context that most news outlets don't have time to build. The distribution of these 8,500 aftershocks shows clustering, geographic clustering, temporal clustering, and some of those clusters are forming in zones that haven't shown this kind of activity in decades. You're looking at aftershocks radiating outward from the main rupture zone, which is expected, but you're also looking at aftershocks in adjacent fault systems, faults that shouldn't theoretically be activated by the primary event, but clearly are. This is called stress transfer. When one part of the crust ruptures violently, it redistributes the tectonic stress throughout the surrounding volume. That redistribution doesn't happen evenly. It concentrates in certain areas, and those concentrations can trigger slip on faults that were otherwise stable. In the Philippines, that's happening across multiple fault systems. In Luzon, in the Visayas, in the approach zones toward Mindanao. The depth distribution matters too. This is where it gets genuinely serious. Most aftershocks cluster near the main rupture plane, typically within a few kilometers of the surface to maybe 30 kilometers down. But PHIVOLCS is recording aftershocks at depths of 60, 70, even 80 kilometers. These deep aftershocks suggest that the rupture extended deeper than initial analysis indicated, or that stress-triggered slip is occurring in the subduction zone itself, the boundary where the Philippine Sea Plate is sliding beneath the Eurasian Plate. That's not a minor detail. That's the difference between a significant but contained event and a precursor to something larger. Here's what the news cycle doesn't have room to explain. When aftershocks persist beyond the first week, when they're still coming at rates of hundreds per day 2 weeks later, when they're still measurable 3 weeks in, you're looking at a fault system that hasn't found mechanical stability. The rock mass is still moving, it's still adjusting, and in a subduction zone context, that sustained activity can indicate that the rupture zone is continuing to propagate, either forward or downward or laterally, into segments that didn't slip during the initial earthquake. The Philippines is sitting directly on one of the world's most hazardous subduction zones. This isn't like California's strike-slip faults, where earthquakes happen, stress is released, and the system settles. This is a zone where oceanic crust is actively descending into the mantle at several centimeters per year. That boundary is capable of magnitude 9 earthquakes. It has produced them. And the current aftershock sequence, while originating from a more moderate event, is disturbing the mechanical equilibrium of that boundary in ways that historical patterns suggest can be precursory. Let's move to the ground level reality, the actual impact on actual people and actual infrastructure. In Manila, a metropolitan area of roughly 13 million people, the ground shook hard. Older buildings swayed, modern buildings with good seismic design rode it out. But days later, weeks later, inspections were finding cracks that shouldn't have been there based on the intensity of motion recorded at ground level. Sheer cracks in concrete, separation at connection points. These are signatures of resonant amplification. The building responded to the shaking at its own natural frequency, amplifying the motion and generating internal forces that exceeded design assumptions. And when each subsequent aftershock hits at similar frequencies, each one compounds the damage. By the time you reach the 800 or 900 aftershock, you're looking at cumulative deterioration that could suddenly accelerate.